There are places where silence becomes its own kind of testimony, where the absence of answers speaks louder than any confession. And sometimes, what we don't find is far more disturbing than what we do. This is the account of Riverside Plantation in Charleston County, South Carolina, a place where people vanished without crossing a single boundary line, without fleeing into the night, without leaving footprints toward freedom. They simply ceased to exist. And when the truth finally surfaced, those who uncovered it would spend the rest of their lives wishing they had left certain doors unopened. Marcus Webb had always found comfort in numbers. While other young men in Charleston spent their evenings in taverns or pursuing romantic interests, Webb preferred the quiet satisfaction of balanced ledgers and properly filed documents. At 32 years old, he had worked as a clerk in the Charleston County Tax Assessor's office for nearly a decade. And in that time, he had developed an almost supernatural ability to spot inconsistencies in financial records. It was a Thursday afternoon in September of 1857 when Webb first noticed something peculiar about Riverside Plantation. The autumn sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the county office, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air as Webb methodically processed the year's property tax assessments. He had developed a rhythm to this work. Open the file, verify the property description, check the declared value, confirm the enslaved population count, calculate the tax, record the payment, close the file, move to the next. Riverside's file was unremarkable at first glance. 300 acres of prime cotton land along the Ashley River. Property value declared at $12,000. Enslaved population, 43 individuals. Tax paid in full. On time. No arrears. Everything appeared perfectly ordinary. Webb was about to close the file when something made him pause. A tickle of memory. A sense of déjà vu. He had processed this file before, of course he processed it every year, but there was something about that number. 43. He stood up from his desk and walked to the filing cabinets that lined the western wall of the office. His colleagues had long since departed for the day, leaving Webb alone with the endless rows of documents that represented every piece of taxable property in Charleston County. He pulled the files for Riverside Plantation going back 5 years and carried them back to his desk. 1853, 43 enslaved individuals. 1854, 43 enslaved individuals. 1855, 43 enslaved individuals. 1856, 43 enslaved individuals. 1857, 43 enslaved individuals. Webb sat back in his chair, frowning. In his decade of experience, he had never seen a plantation maintain an exactly stable enslaved population over 5 consecutive years. Never. The number always fluctuated. There were births, usually several per year in a population that size. There were deaths, from disease, accident, or simply the brutal wear of plantation labor. There were sales to other plantations, purchases from estate auctions, trades between neighboring properties. The population always went up or down. A variance of 3 to 5 people per year was typical. 10 people wasn't unusual. But 5 years of precisely 43. That wasn't just unusual. That was statistically improbable to the point of impossibility. Webb pulled a separate ledger from his drawer, his personal record where he tracked patterns and anomalies he'd noticed over the years. It was an unofficial document, something he maintained out of his own obsessive need for understanding. He began cross-referencing Riverside against comparable plantations in the region. Oakmont Plantation, 3 miles north of Riverside, 320 acres. Population had ranged from 38 to 46 over the same 5-year period. Willow Creek, 5 miles east, 280 acres. Population had ranged from 31 to 41. Magnolia Heights, similar size and crop yield to Riverside. Population had varied from 40 to 52. Every single comparable property showed normal fluctuation. Except Riverside. Webb might have dismissed it as careless record-keeping. Perhaps Nathaniel Hartley, the owner, simply reported the same number each year out of laziness. Except that Webb was nothing if not thorough. He pulled the detailed inventories that were sometimes filed along with the tax assessments, documents that listed not just the number of enslaved people, but their names, ages, and assigned work. And that's when the real anomaly revealed itself. The names changed. In 1855, the inventory listed a man named Thomas, age 34, field worker. In the 1857 inventory, Thomas was gone. In his place was a man named Robert, age 33, also listed as a field worker. Similar age, same job category, but different person. A woman named Sarah, age 28, house servant, appeared in the 1854 inventory, but was absent from the 1856 listing. In her place was a woman named Grace, age 27, also a house servant. Webb went through the lists methodically, making notes in his precise handwriting. Over the 5-year period, 19 names had disappeared from the inventories and been replaced by 19 different names, but the total remained exactly 43. It was as if Hartley was maintaining the population the way a shopkeeper maintains inventory, replacing items as they were depleted, always keeping the stock level constant. But these weren't items. These were people. Webb worked late into the evening, his candle burning low as he cross-referenced the disappearing names against every other document he could find. Bills of sale recorded with the county, death certificates, marriage records, property transfers, manumission papers for those granted freedom, newspaper advertisements for escaped slaves. He found nothing. Not a single document that explained where the 19 missing people had gone. When the courthouse bell struck 10 o'clock, Webb finally gathered his papers and locked the office. As he walked through the dark streets of Charleston toward his boarding house, his mind continued working on the puzzle. There had to be a logical explanation. There always was. Perhaps Hartley kept his records elsewhere, filed bills of sale with a different county office, or simply neglected to properly document deaths. But Webb knew the law. Property transactions, and enslaved people were legally property, had to be recorded with the county. Failure to do so was tax evasion, and Hartley seemed meticulous about paying his taxes on time and in full. A man that careful about his financial obligations didn't simply forget to file important legal documents. Webb's boarding house was a narrow 3-story building on Meeting Street, run by a widow named Mrs. Caroline Foster who maintained strict rules about noise and propriety. He climbed the stairs to his second-floor room, lit the lamp on his writing desk, and spread out his notes. He had documented an anomaly. That much was certain. But was it merely administrative sloppiness, or was it evidence of something more troubling? Webb decided he needed more information. And he knew exactly where to look. Reverend Jonathan Pritchard had been born in Boston in 1809 to a family of modest means but strong religious conviction. His father had been a circuit preacher in Massachusetts, and young Jonathan had accompanied him on countless visits to small congregations throughout New England. He had learned early that ministry was less about grand sermons delivered from marble pulpits, and more about the quiet, patient work of listening to people's fears and sorrows. Pritchard had moved to South Carolina in 1838, drawn by a calling to bring spiritual comfort to both the enslaved population and the white families of the plantation regions. It was delicate work, navigating the complex social hierarchies and unspoken rules that governed every interaction in the antebellum South. He was not an abolitionist, at least not publicly, because to be openly opposed to slavery would have meant immediate expulsion from the region and the end of any good he might do. Instead, he worked within the system, offering what small mercies and dignities he could. Now at 49 years old, with graying hair and the lean build of a man who spent more time in spiritual contemplation than physical comfort, Pritchard made his rounds throughout Charleston County with practiced regularity. He held services at the various plantation chapels, visited sickbeds, officiated at marriages and funerals, and served as a conduit for messages between separated families. It was this last role, carrying news between people who were not permitted to travel freely, that had first alerted Pritchard to the peculiar situation at Riverside Plantation. In November of 1857, on a crisp autumn morning with the smell of wood smoke in the air, Pritchard was conducting a service at Oakmont Plantation for the enslaved population there. The service was held in a simple wooden structure behind the main fields, and about 40 people attended. Pritchard had long ago learned to read the faces of his congregation, to see beyond the careful masks they wore around white people. Today, he sensed an unusual undercurrent of tension. After the service, as people filed out, an elderly woman named Bessie approached him. She was perhaps 70 years old, her back bent from decades of field work, her hands gnarled with arthritis, but her eyes were sharp and clear. "Reverend," she said quietly, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "Might I have a word?" Pritchard nodded and followed her to a spot behind the chapel, out of sight of the main plantation buildings. Bessie's hands trembled as she spoke. "I need to ask you about my grandson, Henry. He's at Riverside. Or he was. I ain't heard from him in near 2 years now, and I'm worried sick." Pritchard knew that maintaining family connections across plantations was one of the most important services he provided. "When did you last receive word from him?" "Spring of 1856. He was courting a girl over at the Mitchell place, just 3 miles from Riverside. Mr. Hartley would give him a pass once a month to go visiting. Henry, he's a good boy, Reverend. Respectful. He'd send me messages through the girl's family, let me know he was doing all right." Bessie paused, her voice catching. Then in April of 56, the messages stopped. "At first I thought maybe he'd gotten in trouble, lost his visiting privileges. But the girl, Leah, her name is, she kept asking after him. Finally, in June, her family sent word to Riverside asking when Henry might visit again." "What did they say?" "Said there weren't no Henry at Riverside. Said they didn't know who we were talking about." Bessie's eyes filled with tears. "But there was a Henry there, Reverend. I know there was. He was my daughter's boy. She died when he was small. And Mr. Hartley bought him at an estate sale in 1851. I got word to him regular for 5 years, and he always wrote back. A boy don't just disappear." Pritchard felt a chill despite the mild weather. "Did they say he'd been sold? Or perhaps passed away?" Bessie shook her head vigorously. "That's just it. They didn't say nothing. Just said there weren't no Henry there and never had been, far as they knew. Like he never existed at all." Pritchard took Bessie's hand gently. "I'll make inquiries. Perhaps there's been some confusion, some mistake in the records." But as he rode away from Oakmont that afternoon, Pritchard felt deeply uneasy. A mistake was possible, certainly. But the flat denial of Henry's existence seemed strange. If the young man had died or been sold, why not simply say so? Over the following weeks, Pritchard began to pay closer attention to the whispered conversations he overheard, the questions people asked him, the stories that circulated through the invisible networks that connected enslaved communities across the region. And he kept hearing about Riverside. In early December, at a Christmas service at Willow Creek Plantation, a middle-aged man named James pulled him aside. "Reverend, I heard you were asking about Riverside. I got something to tell you, but you got to promise to be careful with it." "Of course. My wife's sister, Ruth, she was at Riverside. Smart woman, could read a little, even. Mr. Hartley used her in the main house, helping with correspondence and such. My wife, she'd get letters from Ruth every few months. Not real letters, you understand, but messages passed through various people, the way we do." Pritchard nodded. He was intimately familiar with the complex chains of communication that enslaved people maintained despite all efforts to isolate them. "Last message we got from Ruth was in January of 56, James continued. She said things at Riverside were strange. Said people were scared. Said Mr. Hartley had a place, some kind of building away from the main quarters, and sometimes people would be taken there and they'd come back, different. Hurt. Or they wouldn't come back at all. Different how? She didn't say exactly. Just said there were people who couldn't work no more after they'd been to that place. Laid up in their cabins, not healing right. And others who just disappeared. And when you'd ask about them, you'd be told they'd been sold off or had run away. But Ruth didn't believe it. She said something bad was happening. And you haven't heard from her since." James's face hardened. "Not a word in near 2 years. We sent messages asking after her. Got told she'd been sold to a plantation in Georgia. But there ain't no bill of sale been recorded. I know that because my master keeps good records. And he asked around for us. Ruth just vanished, Reverend. Like she never was. Pritchard felt the weight of something terrible beginning to settle on his shoulders. How many others? How many people have disappeared from Riverside that you know of? Just what I heard through different people. Maybe 7 or 8. Maybe more. Hard to know for certain. But there's families all over Charleston County wondering where their people went. And they all wondering about the same place. Riverside. That evening, Pritchard sat in his modest room at the boarding house where he stayed in Charleston and made a list of names. People he'd been asked about. People who had connections to Riverside and had seemingly vanished. Henry. Ruth. Samuel. Eliza. William. Patience. Joshua. 7 names. 7 people who had family members desperately seeking news. 7 individuals who had disappeared from Riverside Plantation without any documented explanation. Pritchard knew he had to do something. But what? He was a minister with no official authority, no power to demand answers from a property owner like Nathaniel Hartley. Going to the local sheriff would require evidence, and all he had were the worried reports of enslaved people, testimony that carried no legal weight in South Carolina courts. He needed to build a case, to gather enough information that someone with actual authority would have to pay attention. And he needed help. Marcus Webb received the Reverend Pritchard's note on a cold morning in January of 1858. It was brief and formal. Mr. Webb, I have reason to believe you may have information relevant to concerns I have been investigating. Might we meet to discuss a matter of some urgency? Yours in service, Reverend J. Pritchard, *. Webb was intrigued. He knew of Pritchard by reputation. The minister was well regarded for his work among the plantation communities. But they had never met. What could Pritchard want with a county tax clerk? They met at a small cafe on King Street, a respectable establishment where businessmen took their midday meals. Pritchard arrived precisely on time, dressed in his customary black suit with a plain white collar. After ordering coffee, he got straight to the point. Mr. Webb, I understand you maintain the property tax records for Charleston County. I do. And those records include inventories of enslaved populations at the various plantations. They do, though the level of detail varies depending on what the property owners choose to file. Pritchard leaned forward slightly. I need to ask you about Riverside Plantation. Owned by Mr. Nathaniel Hartley. Webb felt his pulse quicken. That's interesting. I've recently been reviewing the Riverside records myself. May I ask what prompted your inquiry? I've been contacted by several families, 8 to be precise, who have lost touch with relatives who were working at Riverside. In each case, the person simply stopped communicating. No explanation. No documented sale or death. No escape attempt reported. They just disappeared. Webb set down his coffee cup carefully. Reverend, would you mind if I showed you something? He pulled out the notebook where he'd been compiling his research and laid it open on the table. For the next hour, the 2 men compared notes. Webb explained the statistical impossibility of a stable population count over multiple years combined with changing names in the inventories. Pritchard shared the names he'd collected and the stories behind each disappearance. The correlation was undeniable. Several of the names Pritchard had been asked about, Henry, Ruth, Samuel, matched names that had disappeared from Webb's records between inventory years. This is more than administrative negligence, Pritchard said quietly. People are vanishing, Mr. Webb. And no one in authority seems to notice or care. Because enslaved people don't have families who can petition the courts or demand investigations, Webb said bitterly. Their property, legally speaking. If Hartley wants to keep sloppy records, who's going to challenge him? We are, Pritchard said firmly. Or at least we're going to try. Over the following weeks, Webb and Pritchard worked together to build their case. Webb used his access to county records to trace every document related to Riverside Plantation going back a decade. He found property deeds, tax payments, crop yield reports, equipment purchases, everything except what he was looking for. No bills of sale for enslaved people sold away from Riverside. No death certificates filed with the county. No manumission papers. No escape advertisements in the newspapers. The people were simply vanishing from the paper trail. Meanwhile, Pritchard quietly expanded his network of contacts, speaking with people at plantations throughout the region. He was careful to be discreet. He didn't want word of his investigation reaching Hartley prematurely. But the more he asked, the more stories he heard. A woman at Magnolia Heights told him, "We heard from him for about 6 months. He said the work was hard, but no worse than other places." Then the letters stopped. "Master wrote to Riverside asking if my brother could send word to ease our minds. Got a letter back saying he'd been sold to a planter in Mississippi. But we never heard from him again. And when Master tried to track down which plantation in Mississippi, the trail went cold." A man at Willow Creek reported, "My cousin had worked at Riverside as a blacksmith. Good with horses, good with iron. Mr. Hartley paid well for him at auction. But after about a year, my cousin stopped responding to messages. When I finally got permission to visit Riverside in person, took me 6 months to arrange it, I was told my cousin had tried to run away and had been sold as punishment to a slave trader heading to Louisiana. But my cousin weren't no fool, sir. He had a wife and 2 children at another plantation. He wouldn't run. He had everything to lose and nothing to gain." Story after story, all following the same pattern. People purchased by Hartley. Working at Riverside for 6 months to 2 years. Then disappearing without convincing explanation. By March of 1858, Webb and Pritchard had documented 23 cases of suspicious disappearances associated with Riverside Plantation over the previous 8 years. 23 people who had families asking after them, whose vanishing had left trails of grief and unanswered questions. "We need to take this to someone with authority to investigate," Webb said during one of their meetings. "But I'm not sure who will listen." "The sheriff," Pritchard suggested. "Thomas Dalton. He's been in office for 15 years. He's no reformer, but he's honest in his own way. If we present this properly, he might have to act." Might being the operative word, Webb said skeptically. "Hartley is a respected property owner. We're talking about challenging him based on the testimony of enslaved people and some irregularities in bookkeeping. That's not exactly solid ground in Charleston County." "No," Pritchard agreed. "But it's all we have. And I can't," his voice caught slightly. "I can't keep looking at the families who ask me about their missing loved ones and tell them there's nothing to be done. Someone has to try." Webb nodded slowly. "Then we make our case as strong as possible. We need to be methodical. Irrefutable. We need to document everything so thoroughly that Dalton has no choice but to investigate." They spent another 2 weeks preparing their presentation, compiling documents, cross-referencing names, building timelines. Webb created charts showing the statistical impossibility of Riverside's stable population. Pritchard wrote detailed accounts of each family's story, lending human faces and voices to the numbers on Webb's spreadsheets. Finally, in late March of 1858, they requested a meeting with Sheriff Dalton. Sheriff Thomas Dalton's office was located in a sturdy brick building near the Charleston County Courthouse. At 52 years old, Dalton had held his position for 15 years through a combination of competence, political savvy, and a keen understanding of which battles were worth fighting in Charleston's complex social landscape. He was a large man, not fat, but solid, with thick gray hair and the weathered face of someone who spent considerable time outdoors. He had a reputation for being fair, but not particularly energetic. He maintained order, arrested obvious criminals, and generally kept the peace without rocking any boats. When Marcus Webb and Reverend Pritchard arrived at his office on a Thursday afternoon, Dalton greeted them with professional courtesy but obvious weariness. He knew both men by reputation, and he suspected their visit was not going to be a simple matter. "Gentlemen," he said, gesturing to the chairs in front of his desk. "What can I do for you?" Webb and Pritchard had agreed beforehand to let Webb present the documentary evidence first. Numbers and records carried more weight with men like Dalton than emotional appeals. Webb spread his papers across the desk systematically. "Sheriff, we're here about Riverside Plantation." Owned by Nathaniel Hartley. I've been reviewing the tax records, and I found significant irregularities. Dalton leaned back in his chair. What kind of irregularities? The enslaved population count has remained constant at 43 individuals for 7 consecutive years. In my experience processing records for every plantation in Charleston County, this is unprecedented. Population numbers always fluctuate due to births, deaths, sales, and purchases. Maybe Hartley's just been consistent in his management, Dalton said, though his tone suggested he was already skeptical. That's what I thought initially, Webb continued. But when I examined the detailed inventories, I found that while the total number remains constant, the names change significantly from year to year. At least 23 people have disappeared from the inventories over the past 8 years and been replaced by 23 different individuals. So he's been buying and selling. What's unusual about that? There are no bills of sale recorded with the county, Webb said, letting that sink in. Not for any purchases to Riverside. And not for any sales from Riverside. Over 8 years, not a single documented transaction. Dalton frowned. That was unusual. Property transactions were supposed to be recorded, if only for tax purposes. Additionally, Webb continued, there are no death certificates filed for anyone at Riverside during this period. In 8 years, in a population of approximately 43 people, not one documented death. And no escape advertisements, Pritchard added. I've checked every newspaper in Charleston and the surrounding counties. Riverside has never reported a runaway slave. Not once in 8 years. Dalton was beginning to look uncomfortable. What exactly are you suggesting? Pritchard leaned forward. Sheriff, I've been contacted by 8 different families who have lost touch with relatives who were working at Riverside. In each case, the person simply stopped communicating. When inquiries were made, Riverside claimed the person had been sold away or had died or had never been there at all. But there's no documentation for any of these explanations. The testimony of, Dalton hesitated, clearly trying to phrase this diplomatically. The concerns of enslaved people don't constitute legal evidence, Reverend. You know that. I do. But the absence of proper documentation does. Mr. Webb isn't bringing me hearsay. He's showing you verifiable records that don't add up. People are disappearing from the tax rolls with no legal explanation. That's not a moral question. That's a question of proper record-keeping and tax compliance. Dalton drummed his fingers on the desk, clearly wrestling with the situation. On one hand, the evidence Webb had compiled was genuinely troubling. On the other hand, investigating a respected property owner based on bookkeeping discrepancies and the concerns of enslaved families was politically risky. Let me be clear about something, Dalton said finally. Nathaniel Hartley is a well-regarded member of Charleston society. His family has owned land in this county for 3 generations. If I go questioning him based on what you've shown me, and it turns out to be nothing more than sloppy paperwork, there will be consequences for all of us. I understand that, Webb said. But I'm a county employee, and part of my responsibility is ensuring accurate tax records. If Hartley is failing to properly document sales and purchases, he may be evading taxes. That's within your jurisdiction to investigate. It was a clever argument, Dalton had to admit. Framing it as a tax compliance issue rather than a human. Dalton stood and walked to his window, looking out at the street below. A merchant's cart rattled past. 2 well-dressed ladies walked by with parasols. Ordinary life continuing while he contemplated something that might upend that ordinariness. I'll visit Riverside, he said finally. I'll ask Hartley about his record-keeping and request to see his documentation. But I'm not promising anything beyond that. If he has reasonable explanations, that's where it ends. That's all we ask, Pritchard said. But as Webb and Pritchard left the sheriff's office, Webb couldn't shake the feeling that they were setting something in motion that none of them fully understood yet. They had uncovered an anomaly, yes. But what did it mean? Was Hartley simply a careless administrator? Or was there something darker happening at Riverside? 3 days later, Sheriff Dalton sent word that he would be visiting Riverside Plantation the following week to conduct what he termed a routine inspection of records. The investigation had officially begun. The road to Riverside Plantation wound through stands of oak and pine, the spring sunlight filtering through new leaves and creating patterns of light and shadow on the dirt path. Sheriff Dalton rode his horse at a steady pace, accompanied by his deputy, Frank Carson, a younger man who served primarily as a witness to official business. It was mid-April, and the cotton plants were still small, just beginning to emerge in neat rows across the fields. As they approached the plantation property, Dalton took note of everything with the practiced eye of someone used to observing details. The entrance was marked by a simple wooden gate with "Riverside" carved into the crossbeam. The main drive was well maintained, lined with young magnolia trees that would be impressive in a few years. The plantation house came into view after about a quarter mile, a substantial two-story structure in the federal style, painted white with dark green shutters. Not ostentatious by Charleston standards, but clearly the home of a man of means. A stable boy, a young black teenager, came forward to take their horses as Dalton and Carson dismounted. The boy wouldn't meet their eyes, Dalton noted. Just did his job and hurried away. Nathaniel Hartley emerged onto the front porch before they could knock. He was a man of about 55, Dalton estimated, with thinning brown hair going gray at the temples and a lean, almost ascetic build. He wore simple but well-made clothing, dark trousers, a white shirt, a vest. His face was intelligent, with sharp features and eyes that assessed the visitors with evident wariness. "Sheriff Dalton," Hartley said, his tone polite but cool. "This is unexpected. I hope there's no trouble." "Just a routine matter, Mr. Hartley. Nothing to be concerned about. I wonder if we might have a word." "Of course. Please come in." The interior of the house was comfortable but not lavish. The parlor, where Hartley led them, contained good furniture but nothing extravagant. What caught Dalton's attention was the library visible through an open doorway, floor-to-ceiling shelves packed with books. Medical texts he could see, agricultural journals, scientific volumes. "You're a reading man," Dalton observed. "I find the intellectual life more satisfying than social pursuits," Hartley said. "My late wife was the social one. After her passing, I've become something of a hermit, I'm afraid. Can I offer you gentlemen some refreshment? Tea? Something stronger?" "Nothing, thank you. As I said, this is just a routine visit. There have been some questions about record keeping. Tax documentation, that sort of thing. The county clerk's office is conducting a general audit of plantation inventories, and there are a few details about Riverside that need clarifying." Hartley's expression didn't change, but Dalton sensed a subtle tension enter the room. "What sort of details?" "Well, for instance, your tax returns show a consistent population of 43 enslaved individuals over the past several years. That's unusually stable. Most plantations see more fluctuation. Births, deaths, sales. I suppose I've been fortunate," Hartley said smoothly. "I purchased primarily adults of working age, which minimizes the care required for children and the elderly. And I've implemented modern agricultural techniques that reduce the physical strain on workers, which improves their longevity." "That's impressive. But surely there have been some deaths. Disease, accidents, that sort of thing." "A few, naturally. But I've replaced those losses through purchases. I believe in maintaining a consistent workforce. It creates stability and efficiency." "Of course. And those purchases would have been documented with bills of sale." For just a moment, something flickered in Hartley's eyes. "Naturally. Though I confess my record-keeping may not be as meticulous as it should be. Much of my documentation is with my attorney in Charleston for various business matters." "I see. Might I ask who your attorney is?" "Gerald Payton. Of Payton and Associates." Dalton knew Payton by reputation, a competent attorney who handled property matters for several plantations. "And these documents have been with him for some time?" "Various periods. Some matters take longer to resolve than others." It was a reasonable answer, impossible to challenge without seeming unreasonably suspicious. Dalton decided to change his approach. "I wonder if I might tour the property, see how your modern agricultural methods are working." I have to admit, I'm curious about any techniques that improve efficiency. Again, that slight hesitation. Of course, though I'm not sure there's much to see that would be different from any other plantation. But you're welcome to look around. They stepped outside. Carson, Dalton noticed, had said nothing throughout the conversation, just observed silently as he'd been instructed to do. Good man. Carson knew when to watch and listen. As they walked, Dalton made a point of looking around casually, taking in everything. The slave quarters were visible to the east, a row of small cabins, perhaps a dozen in all. Standard construction, no better or worse than most plantations. Some had smoke coming from chimneys despite the mild weather, suggesting people inside. But the fields themselves seemed sparse. They passed 7 people working in the north field, carefully tending the young cotton plants. 5 more in the east field. A few more visible in the distance. For a 300-acre plantation, it seemed like an unusually small workforce to have visible at midday during the growing season. Your workers seem to have things well in hand, Dalton observed. Though I count fewer than I'd expect for property of this size. Rotation system, Hartley explained. I have different crews working different sections on alternating days. Prevents soil depletion and reduces the risk of crop disease spreading. Some of my workers are on their rest rotation today. They approached the slave quarters, and Dalton gestured toward them. Mind if we step inside one of the cabins? Part of the inspection protocol. Hartley's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I'm not sure that's necessary, Sheriff. These are people's homes, such as they are. I'd rather not disturb them during the workday. I assure you it won't take long. Just want to verify that your population count is accurate. Standard procedure. There was a long moment where the 2 men looked at each other, and Dalton knew they were both aware of the real conversation happening beneath the polite words. Hartley was trying to prevent him from seeing something, and Dalton was insisting on seeing it. The question was whether Hartley would push the confrontation into the open or continue the pretense of cooperation. Finally, Hartley nodded. Of course. Though I'm not sure what you expect to find. They entered one of the cabins, a single room perhaps 12 feet square with a dirt floor, a rough fireplace, a few pieces of crude furniture. A woman sat on the floor in the corner, her back to the wall, her head down. She didn't look up when they entered. This is Jemima, Hartley said. She's been ill with a fever. I've had my physician attend to her. Dalton approached slowly. Ma'am. Are you all right? The woman didn't respond. Didn't even seem to register that he'd spoken. The fever has left her somewhat addled, Hartley said quickly. She'll recover with rest. But Dalton had spent enough years in law enforcement to recognize something wrong when he saw it. This wasn't fever. This was trauma. The woman was present in body but absent in every other way, staring at nothing with eyes that saw nothing. How long has she been like this? Dalton asked. A few days. As I said, she'll recover. They moved to another cabin. Inside, an elderly man sat on a rough bed, his leg wrapped in bandages. He looked up when they entered, and Dalton saw fear flash across his face before he quickly looked down. This is Marcus, Hartley said. Work accident. Injured his leg in the mill. He's recovering. Dalton examined the bandages from a distance. They seemed professionally done, recently changed. But there was something about the way the old man held himself, the way he wouldn't meet anyone's eyes. You said you have a physician who attends to your workers? Dalton asked. Dr. Fletcher from Charleston. He visits twice weekly. Dalton knew Fletcher, a competent doctor who served several plantations. Everything Hartley was saying was reasonable. Explainable. But the feeling of wrongness was growing stronger with every moment. They toured several more cabins. Some were empty. In others, people lay in bed or sat quietly, all with the same quality of withdrawal, of carefully maintained invisibility. No one would look at the sheriff directly. No one spoke unless directly addressed, and then only in barely audible whispers. Dalton had visited many plantations over his years as sheriff. He'd seen the way enslaved people acted around authority, different, careful, maintaining a protective distance. But this was different. This was fear that ran deeper than caution. This was terror that had settled into the bones. "I'd like to see all your workers assembled," Dalton said as they emerged from the last cabin. "I need to do an actual count for the county records." "That will take some time," Hartley objected. "They're scattered across the property working." "I have time." Another long look passed between them. Then Hartley nodded curtly. "Very well. Daniel," he called to a young man working nearby. "Go round up everyone. Tell them to assemble in front of the main house." It took nearly an hour. Slowly, people began to gather, coming from the fields, from various outbuildings, from the quarters. Dalton counted carefully as they assembled, noting each person. Carson wrote the count in his notebook. 38 people. When no more appeared, Dalton turned to Hartley. "You're 5 short of the 43 you reported. Peter is in Charleston on an errand. Should be back tomorrow. Rose is in her cabin, she's quite ill, as you saw, and I didn't want to force her out. The others must be at the far fields. It's a large property, Sheriff. I don't keep everyone in sight at all times." Dalton nodded slowly. "I'd like to see your personal records. Your bills of sale, death records, anything that documents the composition of your workforce. As I mentioned, much of that is with my attorney." "Then what records do you keep here?" Hartley's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "Are you accusing me of something, Sheriff? Because if you are, I'd appreciate you being direct about it." "I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm conducting a routine records inspection. If your documentation is in order, this will be resolved quickly." "My documentation is perfectly in order. But I'm not in the habit of having my property and my papers examined without cause. If the county has specific concerns, they can be addressed through official channels with my attorney present." It was a challenge, carefully worded, but unmistakable. Hartley was asserting his rights as a property owner, putting legal barriers between himself and the investigation. Dalton had to make a decision. He could push harder, demand access to the records, potentially force a confrontation. But he had no warrant, no specific evidence of wrongdoing, only suspicions and irregularities. If he overreached and Hartley complained to the county authorities, Dalton could find himself in significant trouble. "I understand, Mr. Hartley. I'll contact your attorney to arrange for the review of documents. In the meantime, I'd appreciate it if you could provide a complete list of your current workforce, names, ages, and duties, to the county office within the week." "I'll do my best. As I said, I'm not the most meticulous record keeper." They returned to their horses. As they prepared to leave, Dalton took one more look around the property, and that's when he noticed it. Far to the west, almost hidden by a stand of trees, was a stone structure that didn't quite fit with the rest of the plantation buildings. "What's that building?" he asked, pointing. Hartley turned to look, and for the first time his composure genuinely cracked, just for an instant, but Dalton saw it. A flash of something that might have been fear or anger or both. "Old ice house," Hartley said, his voice carefully controlled. "From my father-in-law's time. It's not in use anymore. Structural problems. Part of the roof has collapsed. Dangerous, actually. I've been meaning to have it demolished. Mind if I take a look?" "I'd rather you didn't, Sheriff. As I said, it's not safe. I wouldn't want you injured on my property. Liability concerns. You understand. I'm careful. Nevertheless, I must insist. If you were hurt, it could create significant legal complications. I'm sure you understand." There it was again. The polite refusal, the reasonable-sounding objection that was really a wall going up. Dalton had seen enough in his career to know when someone was hiding something. The question was whether he had the grounds to push through that wall. "I'll need to inspect it eventually," Dalton said carefully. "For the county records. If it's a hazardous structure." "Of course." When I'm ready to have it demolished, I'll notify the county, and you're welcome to inspect it then. But not today, Sheriff. I'm afraid I must insist on that point. Dalton held Hartley's gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded and mounted his horse. Thank you for your time, Mr. Hartley. I'll be in touch. As they rode back down the long drive toward the main road, Carson finally spoke. That was strange, Sheriff. All of it. Yes, Dalton agreed. Yes, it was. What do we do now? Dalton was quiet for a moment, thinking. They had reached the limits of what could be done through polite inquiry. Hartley had been cooperative on the surface while blocking every substantive investigation. The people at Riverside were clearly terrified of something, but none of them would speak openly. They couldn't, not in front of Hartley. Now, Dalton said slowly, we build a real case. Because something is very wrong at Riverside Plantation. And Nathaniel Hartley is working very hard to make sure we don't find out what it is. The day after his visit to Riverside, Sheriff Dalton sat in his office reviewing his notes with Webb and Pritchard. The three men had formed an unlikely investigative team, each bringing different strengths to the effort. He's hiding something, Dalton said flatly. That much is certain. But proving it is another matter entirely. What about the people you saw? Pritchard asked. The woman who wouldn't respond, the men with the injured leg. Couldn't you tell something was wrong? Of course I could tell. But something seems wrong isn't evidence. Hartley has explanations for everything. Fever. Work accident. Rest rotations. On paper, it all sounds reasonable. Webb tapped his pencil against his notebook. What about the count? You found 38 people, not 43. Hartley explained that, too. One in Charleston, one too sick to appear, others working in distant fields. Again, all reasonable on the surface. What about that building? Carson, who had joined them, asked. The ice house. He really didn't want you looking at it. No, he didn't. But he's within his rights to refuse access to a dangerous structure on his own property. I'd need a warrant to force the issue. And to get a warrant, I'd need probable cause. So far, all I have is suspicion. Pritchard leaned forward. Then how do we get probable cause? The question hung in the air. How did they investigate a man who was determined not to be investigated, who had the law and social standing on his side? We need testimony, Dalton said finally. Real testimony from people who know what's happening at Riverside. But getting the testimony is the problem. Why? Webb asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. Because enslaved people can't testify against white property owners in South Carolina courts. Their statements carry no legal weight. We need testimony from someone white. Someone with standing. Someone whose word can't be dismissed. Does Hartley have any white employees? Pritchard asked. Overseers. Managers. Dalton shook his head. That's another odd thing. Most plantations this size have at least one white overseer, usually more. Riverside doesn't. Hartley manages everything himself, apparently. Very hands-on. Which gives him complete control over what happens there. No witnesses, Webb observed. No one who might report problems. They sat in frustrated silence for a moment. Then Pritchard spoke up. What if we approach this differently? Instead of trying to investigate Riverside directly, what if we investigate the people who've disappeared? If we can prove that Hartley's claims about selling them or them dying are false, that's evidence of deception. And deception suggests something being hidden. Webb nodded slowly. That could work. We have names. The people who disappeared from the tax inventories. If Hartley claims they were sold, there should be bills of sale. If he claims they died, there should be death certificates or at least burial records. And if he claims they escaped, Dalton added, there should be advertisements offering rewards. Every plantation publishes escape notices. It's standard practice. Over the next several weeks, the three men, along with Carson, worked methodically through the list of disappeared people. They contacted attorneys throughout Charleston and neighboring counties, checking records for any bills of sale involving those individuals. They reviewed death certificates at courthouses. They went through years of newspaper archives looking for escape advertisements. They found nothing. Not one document that explained where any of the 23 missing people had gone. Meanwhile, Pritchard used his position as a minister to quietly interview people at other plantations, asking carefully worded questions about Riverside. What emerged was a pattern that became increasingly disturbing. A woman at Oakmont told him, "We don't talk about Riverside much, Reverend. But everyone knows it's a bad place. People say if you get sold there, you might as well be dead." A man at Willow Creek said, "There's stories, sir. Stories about people screaming in the night. Stories about Mr. Hartley doing things. Medical things. Things that ain't right. But nobody really knows for sure, because people who go to Riverside don't come back to tell about it." An elderly woman at Magnolia Heights whispered, "My mama, she was alive when the old Mr. Hartley, Nathaniel's father-in-law, owned Riverside. She said even back then there was something wrong with that place. Said the old man used to whip his people terrible, and sometimes he'd disappear folks as punishment. She said it was a cursed place. And it seems like the curse didn't lift when young Nathaniel took over. But rumors and stories, no matter how consistent, weren't evidence. They needed something concrete. In early May, they got a break. Dr. Andrew Fletcher, the physician Hartley had mentioned as treating his workers, came to see Sheriff Dalton. Fletcher was a man in his mid-40s with a successful practice in Charleston and a reputation as a competent doctor. "Sheriff," Fletcher said, settling into a chair in Dalton's office, "I understand you've been asking questions about Riverside Plantation." "I have." "Why?" "Because I need to tell you something. And I've been wrestling with my conscience about it for some time." Dalton leaned forward. "I'm listening." Fletcher took a deep breath. "I was retained by Mr. Hartley 3 years ago to provide medical services to his enslaved population. Standard arrangement. I visit twice weekly, treat injuries and illnesses, provide preventative care. Good pay, and Hartley was always punctual with payments. I terminated the arrangement 2 months ago. Told Hartley I was too busy with my Charleston practice to continue the plantation visits. But that wasn't the real reason." "No." Fletcher rubbed his face tiredly. "I lied because I didn't know what else to do. I'm a doctor, Sheriff. I've seen injuries before. Work accidents, falls, burns, all the things that happen on a plantation. But what I saw at Riverside," he trailed off, and Dalton waited patiently. "There were injuries that didn't make sense," Fletcher continued. "Surgical incisions on people who claimed they'd had accidents. Wounds that looked like they'd been made deliberately. Methodically. And the people, they were terrified. Not just cautious around a white doctor, but genuinely, deeply terrified. Did you ask Hartley about it?" "Once. I saw a woman with what looked like an experimental surgical incision on her abdomen. Fresh stitching, done with care, but for no medical reason I could determine. I asked Hartley about it, said I needed to know what treatment she'd received so I could provide proper follow-up care. What did he say? He got very cold. Told me he sometimes performed minor procedures himself, that he'd trained in medicine briefly and maintained an interest in it. Said the woman had complained of abdominal pain and he'd done an exploratory procedure. But, Sheriff, that's not something you do casually. Exploratory surgery is serious. Risky. You don't perform it in a plantation cabin without proper facilities or anesthesia." Fletcher's hands trembled slightly as he spoke. "I started paying more attention after that. I saw more things that didn't add up. People who'd supposedly had work accidents, but whose injuries suggested something more deliberate. Workers who would flinch when Hartley entered the room, who wouldn't speak in his presence. Why didn't you report this before?" "Report what, exactly?" "Suspicions. A sense that something was wrong. I had no proof. Just a growing feeling that Hartley was doing something terrible. And he's a respected man, Sheriff. A man with standing and education. Who would believe a vague accusation from me? I believe you now. Because you've seen it yourself. Because you've been to Riverside and felt that same wrongness. Dalton nodded slowly. Dr. Fletcher, I need you to write down everything you observed at Riverside. Every injury that didn't make sense, every behavior that concerned you, every interaction with Hartley that seemed suspicious. Can you do that? Yes. Though I should tell you, I'm preparing to move to Virginia. My wife's family is there, and I've been offered a position at a hospital in Richmond. I'm not sure how useful my testimony will be if I'm out of state. Write it down anyway. We'll deal with the legal complications later. After Fletcher left, Dalton sat thinking. They finally had testimony from someone with standing, a white professional whose word carried weight. It wasn't proof of murder or specific crimes, but it was evidence of suspicious behavior, of deception, of things being hidden. Combined with the missing documentation, the statistical impossibilities Webb had found, and the pattern of disappearances, they finally had something approaching a case. But it still wasn't enough for a warrant. Not quite. They needed one more piece. One more concrete bit of evidence that would force a judge to authorize a full investigation of Riverside Plantation. The question was how to get it. The answer, when it came, was unexpected and terrible. On a humid night in mid-May, a young man named Jacob staggered into the yard of Oakmont Plantation, 3 miles north of Riverside. He was barefoot, his clothes torn, his body covered in dirt and scratches from running through the woods. He was also bleeding from what appeared to be a poorly stitched wound on his left side. The enslaved residents of Oakmont found him collapsed near the well and immediately called for help. Within an hour, Reverend Pritchard, who happened to be staying at Oakmont that night, was kneeling beside the young man in one of the cabins. Jacob was perhaps 22 years old, thin and weakened by obvious malnutrition and injury. But his eyes were alert, filled with a desperate intensity. "Please," he gasped, gripping Pritchard's hand. "Please don't send me back. Don't let him find me." "Easy now," Pritchard said gently. "Where did you come from?" "Riverside." The word was barely a whisper, but it carried weight like a stone. Pritchard felt his pulse quicken. "You escaped from Riverside?" "Yes, sir. Tonight. While he was working on someone else, I ran. I ran as fast as I could." "Who was working on someone else?" "Mr. Hartley. He does things, Reverend. Terrible things." Pritchard sent someone to fetch Sheriff Dalton immediately, then sat with Jacob through the night, listening as the young man told his story in fragments, interrupted by bouts of pain and fear. Jacob had been purchased by Hartley 8 months earlier at an estate sale in Georgia. He'd been told he was going to work in the cotton fields, standard plantation labor. For the first few weeks, everything had seemed relatively normal. The work was hard, but no harder than he'd experienced before. Hartley was distant, but not overtly cruel. Then one evening, Hartley had come to Jacob's cabin and told him he needed to come to the medical building for a routine health examination. That's what he called it, Jacob said, his voice shaking. A health examination. But it wasn't that. It wasn't that at all. Hartley had taken him to the Stone Ice House, which had been converted into something like a medical facility. There was a table with restraints, shelves with instruments and bottles, lamps for illumination. "He strapped me down," Jacob said. "Said he was going to perform a small procedure, that it would help him understand human anatomy better. He said I was contributing to medical knowledge, that I should be grateful." Pritchard felt sick. "What did he do?" He cut into my side. Right here." Jacob touched the wound, which was still seeping blood through the bandages. He wanted to see how deep he could go before it caused serious damage. He took notes the whole time. Wrote down everything, how I reacted, how much I could tolerate, how the body responded to cutting. Dear God. He gave me something to drink first. Said it would help with the pain. It made everything fuzzy, like I was watching from a distance. But I could still feel it, Reverend. I could still feel everything. Over the following hours, through tears and trembling, Jacob described a systematic regime of medical experimentation that had been conducted on the enslaved population at Riverside. Hartley, who had apparently studied medicine in his youth, had been using people as test subjects for various procedures and anatomical studies. Some people he'd just examine, take measurements, study how the body worked. But others, Jacob's voice broke. Others he'd cut into. Do surgeries that weren't meant to help us. Just to see what would happen. He kept detailed notes on everything. He called it research. How many people has he done this to? I don't know exactly. But there were always people recovering from something. Always people with fresh wounds or injuries. And some people, they'd go to the ice house and never come back. We'd be told they died from disease or an accident. But we knew better. We knew Mr. Hartley had killed them. When Sheriff Dalton arrived at Oakmont just after dawn, he found Pritchard and Dr. Fletcher, who had also been summoned, examining Jacob's wound. It's a clean surgical incision, Fletcher confirmed. Deliberately made and then stitched up. This wasn't an accident or a self-inflicted injury. Someone with medical training did this. Dalton interviewed Jacob carefully, taking detailed notes. The young man's testimony was consistent, specific, and deeply disturbing. He described the layout of the ice house facility, the instruments he'd seen, the journals where Hartley kept his notes. Will you testify to this in court? Dalton asked. Jacob looked terrified. Will it matter? Will anyone believe me? It was a fair question. In South Carolina in 1858, the testimony of an enslaved person against a white property owner was legally inadmissible. But Dalton knew that this case had progressed beyond simple legal procedures. What matters right now, Dalton said carefully, is that we finally have enough evidence to get a warrant. Your testimony, combined with Dr. Fletcher's observations and the documentary evidence Mr. Webb has compiled, gives us grounds for a full investigation. He stood and turned to his deputy. Carson, ride back to Charleston and file for an emergency warrant. I want authority to search Riverside Plantation thoroughly, including that ice house. Tell the judge we have credible evidence of serious crimes. What about Mr. Hartley? Carson asked. Should we arrest him immediately? Dalton considered. If they arrested Hartley before searching the property, he might have allies destroy evidence. But if they waited too long, he might flee if he realized Jacob had escaped and talked. Not yet. But watch the property. Post someone on the road. If Hartley tries to leave, stop him. Tell him it's a routine matter, but don't let him go anywhere until we execute the search. By midday, Dalton had his warrant. The judge, presented with Jacob's testimony corroborated by Dr. Fletcher's professional observations and Webb's documentary evidence, had agreed that sufficient cause existed to authorize a full search of Riverside Plantation and the detention of Nathaniel Hartley for questioning. Dalton gathered a group of 6 deputies, including Carson. He also brought Marcus Webb, who might recognize documents or records that others would miss, and Reverend Pritchard, who had earned his place in the investigation through months of careful work. They rode for Riverside as the afternoon sun began its descent toward evening, casting long shadows across the South Carolina countryside. None of them could have imagined what they were about to discover. Nathaniel Hartley was in his study when Sheriff Dalton and his party arrived. Through the window, he watched as 7 men dismounted and approached the house, and something in his expression shifted, a calculation being made, options being weighed. He met them at the door with a cold civility that was a far cry from his earlier courteous reception. "Sheriff," he said. "This is quite a large party for a social call." "It's not a social call, Mr. Hartley. I have a warrant to search your property." Dalton handed over the document. Hartley read it slowly, his face betraying nothing. "On what grounds?" "We have testimony that you've been conducting illegal medical procedures on your enslaved workers. That some of these procedures have resulted in death. That you've been systematically concealing these deaths and the subsequent disposal of bodies." "Testimony from whom?" Hartley's voice was ice. "Jacob." the young man who escaped from your property last night." Something flickered across Hartley's face. "Ah, yes. I noticed he was missing. An escape. I was planning to file the proper notices today." "You can't possibly credit the testimony of a runaway slave, Sheriff. He's a criminal by definition." "I also have testimony from Dr. Andrew Fletcher regarding suspicious injuries he observed during his visits here. I have documentary evidence of population discrepancies in your tax records. I have reports from multiple families of people who disappeared from Riverside without explanation. It's enough for this warrant, Mr. Hartley. Now step aside." For a long moment, Hartley stood in the doorway, and Dalton's hand moved closer to his pistol, wondering if the man would try to physically resist. Then Hartley stepped back with a slight nod. "Very well. Search as you wish. You won't find anything improper." But his eyes said something different. His eyes said, "You're going to regret this." Dalton left 2 deputies to watch Hartley and the main house. He took the remaining 4 men, plus Webb and Pritchard, and headed directly for the stone ice house at the western edge of the property. As they approached, Dalton noticed enslaved people watching from a distance. None came closer. They simply stood and stared, their faces registering something that might have been hope or terror or both. The ice house door was secured with the same heavy padlock Dalton had seen on his first visit. "Break it," he ordered. Carson smashed the lock with a sledgehammer, and the door swung open. The smell hit them first. Damp earth, old blood, and something chemical and sharp. They lit lanterns and entered. The interior was exactly as Jacob had described. A surgical table in the center with leather restraints bolted to its sides. Along the walls were wooden shelves containing jars, bottles, and medical instruments of various kinds. A work desk held stacks of leather-bound journals. In the corner, partially covered by a tarp, was a large wooden box. "Dear God," Pritchard whispered. Webb approached the desk and carefully opened one of the journals. His face went white as he read. "It's all here," he said, his voice shaking. He documented everything. Dates, procedures, outcomes. "It's like a laboratory record book, except the subjects are," he couldn't finish the sentence. Dalton moved to the wooden box and pulled back the tarp. Inside was salt, hundreds of pounds of preserving salt, and buried in that salt were human remains. Not complete bodies. Pieces. Parts that had been removed and preserved, presumably for further study. One of the deputies ran outside and was violently sick. Pritchard was reading over Webb's shoulder, scanning the journal entries. This one is dated March 1856. Subject, Thomas, age 34. Exploratory abdominal surgery to examine digestive organs. Subject survived procedure but expired 3 days later from infection. Notable observations recorded regarding liver structure. He turned pages. Here's another. June 1856. Subject, Ruth, age 29. Experimental procedure to observe pain response and nervous system function. Administered various levels of stimulus to different body parts. Maintained detailed maps of response zones. Subject remained conscious throughout per design. Dalton felt physically ill. How many entries are there? Webb flipped through the journals. There were 7 of them, each containing dozens of entries. I'd estimate at least 50 individual procedures described in detail. Maybe more. 50 people. No. Some subjects were used for multiple procedures. But I'd say at least 25 to 30 different individuals are named in these journals. Dalton took a deep breath, trying to maintain professional composure despite the horror. They needed to be thorough, methodical. This would go to trial, and every piece of evidence had to be properly documented. "Carson, fetch Mr. Hartley. Bring him here." While they waited, they continued to catalog what they found. Surgical instruments, scalpels, saws, retractors. Bottles of chloroform and ether, presumably used as anesthetics, though many journal entries noted procedures performed without anesthesia, to better observe natural pain response. Jars containing preserved tissue samples, each carefully labeled with a name, date, and type of tissue. On the wall was a large diagram of human anatomy, hand-drawn and annotated extensively. It was actually quite beautiful in its precision and detail, which somehow made it worse. This was knowledge gained through systematic torture, insights purchased with the suffering of people Hartley had viewed as nothing more than laboratory animals. When Hartley was brought into the ice house, flanked by 2 deputies, his expression was oddly calm. He looked around at the assembled men examining his work, and something like resignation crossed his face. "I suppose there's no point in denying it now," he said quietly. "No," Dalton agreed. "There isn't. You'll never understand what I accomplished here. Enlighten me." Hartley gestured to the journals. "Human anatomy is still largely a mystery, Sheriff. We don't fully understand how the body works, how diseases progress, why some injuries heal while others prove fatal. Medical schools can learn only so much from the occasional cadaver of an executed criminal. But here, I had the opportunity to conduct systematic research. To learn things that no textbook can teach." "You tortured and murdered people," Pritchard said, his voice tight with rage. "You took human beings and treated them like animals in an experiment." "I treated them as subjects in the pursuit of knowledge," Hartley corrected. "Knowledge that could save lives. The discoveries I've made about anatomy, about physiology, about the human body's responses to injury and disease, they could revolutionize medical practice." "Did your subjects consent to these discoveries?" Dalton asked coldly. "Consent?" Hartley seemed genuinely puzzled. "Their property, Sheriff. Does one ask a horse's consent before studying its anatomy? Does a farmer request permission from his livestock before slaughter? They're tools. Tools that I purchased legally and used for a purpose that could benefit all of humanity. Yes, some were destroyed in the process. That's the nature of research. But their sacrifice has meaning." "No," Dalton interrupted. "Because it was gained through evil." Hartley's expression hardened. "You're a small-minded man, Sheriff. History will judge my work differently. 50 years from now, 100 years from now, people will understand that I was ahead of my time, that I had the courage to do what was necessary for the advancement of human knowledge." "What I understand," Dalton said, pulling out handcuffs, "is that you're under arrest for murder. Multiple counts. Nathaniel Hartley, you're going to jail. And then you're going to trial. And then you're going to hang." As the deputies led Hartley away, he turned back one last time. "You should know, Sheriff, that I have no regrets. None at all. What I did here was important. It mattered." After Hartley was removed, the men stood in the ice house for a long moment, none of them quite able to process what they'd discovered. Finally, Pritchard spoke. "We need to document everything. Every name in those journals. Every person we can identify. They deserve to be remembered. To have their suffering acknowledged." Webb nodded. "I'll start compiling the information. We'll need it for the trial anyway." Over the following days, the full scope of Hartley's activities came to light. The journals documented 17 deaths directly resulting from his experiments over 6 years. Another 8 people had survived procedures but were permanently disabled by them. The journals also referenced subjects who had disappointed or failed to provide useful data, with notes that they had been disposed of, presumably meaning they had been killed when they were no longer useful for research. The property was searched thoroughly. For burial sites were discovered in remote corners of the plantation, containing the remains of at least 12 individuals. All showed signs of surgical intervention before death. The surviving enslaved population, 38 people, were interviewed extensively. Each told stories of living in constant terror, never knowing who would be selected next for Hartley's examinations. They described watching friends and family disappear into the ice house and never emerge, or emerge broken and traumatized. They spoke of screams in the night, of seeing people carried out on stretchers, of the pervasive fear that saturated every moment of life at Riverside. One woman named Lydia told Pritchard, "We all knew. We all knew what he was doing. But there was nothing we could do. He owned us. He could do whatever he wanted, and no one would stop him. Every night, we'd pray that it wouldn't be us next. Every morning, we'd wake up grateful to still be alive. That's how we lived, Reverend. Not really living at all. Just surviving from one day to the next, waiting to see who would be next. The case made headlines throughout South Carolina and beyond. Newspapers as far north as New York and as far west as New Orleans covered the story, their articles a mixture of horror at Hartley's actions and uncomfortable questions about a system that had made those actions possible for so long. The trial of Nathaniel Hartley began in October of 1858 in the Charleston County Courthouse. It was one of the most sensational legal proceedings in South Carolina history, drawing spectators from across the state and extensive coverage from newspapers throughout the nation. The prosecution was led by District Attorney Martin Chase, a veteran attorney with a reputation for meticulous preparation. He knew the case was both strong in its evidence and complicated in its legal implications. The challenge wasn't proving that Hartley had killed people, the journals and physical evidence made that undeniable. The challenge was navigating the legal and social landscape that considered enslaved people as property rather than persons. Hartley's defense attorney, Benjamin Whitfield, was one of Charleston's most respected lawyers. His strategy was twofold. First, to argue that Hartley's actions, while perhaps morally questionable, were legally within the rights of a property owner to manage his property as he saw fit. Second, to position Hartley as a visionary scientist who had been ahead of his time, whose work would eventually be recognized as valuable despite the questionable methods. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Chase presented the physical evidence systematically, the journals detailing each procedure, the preserved remains found at the property, the burial sites, the surgical instruments. He brought Dr. Fletcher to testify about the suspicious injuries he'd observed and his concerns about Hartley's behavior. The most powerful testimony came from Jacob, the young man who had escaped. While his testimony couldn't legally be used as direct evidence against Hartley, Chase found a way around this by having Jacob describe what he had witnessed in the ice house, the equipment, the layout, the journals, which corroborated the physical evidence. This was permissible as description of observed facts rather than accusation of crimes. Jacob's testimony lasted an entire day. He described being strapped to the table, being cut open while partially conscious, hearing Hartley narrate his observations as if Jacob were an inanimate specimen rather than a suffering human being. By the time he finished, several jury members were visibly disturbed, and spectators in the courtroom sat in stunned silence. Whitfield's cross-examination was brutal but ultimately ineffective. He tried to paint Jacob as a liar and a runaway who would say anything to harm his former master. But Jacob's descriptions matched the physical evidence too precisely to be fabrications. The defense's main arguments came during Whitfield's closing statement. He acknowledged that Hartley had conducted medical procedures on enslaved people at Riverside, but argued this was within his legal rights as property owner. He compared it to a farmer experimenting with new agricultural techniques on his livestock. Perhaps unconventional, perhaps unsuccessful, but not criminal. Gentlemen of the jury, Whitfield said, you must consider the law as it exists, not as you might wish it to be. Mr. Hartley owned these people. He purchased them legally. He maintained them on his property. And yes, he used them for purposes of medical research. You may find this distasteful. You may believe it was morally wrong. But was it illegal? Show me the statute that says a man cannot use his own property as he sees fit. It was a disturbing argument, but it carried legal weight in a society built on slavery. Chase's rebuttal focused on the fact that Hartley had systematically concealed his actions, falsified tax records, and lied to authorities. If Mr. Hartley truly believed his actions were legal and proper, why did he hide them? Why did he deny that people had died when they had? Why did he bury bodies secretly across his property rather than filing death certificates? Why did he maintain false inventories? He paused, letting the questions hang in the air. The answer is simple. Because he knew what he was doing was wrong. Not just morally wrong, but criminally wrong. He knew he was committing murder, and he took steps to conceal those murders. The law recognizes murder, gentlemen. The law punishes murder. And the fact that Mr. Hartley chose victims who had no legal standing to defend themselves doesn't make it any less murder. The judge's instructions to the jury were carefully worded, acknowledging the legal complexities while making clear that deliberate killing, even of enslaved people, exceeded the bounds of property rights. The jury deliberated for 3.5 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood and delivered the verdict. We find the defendant, Nathaniel Hartley, guilty of murder in the first degree. Multiple counts. The courtroom erupted. Some spectators cheered. Others sat in shocked silence. Still others argued loudly about the verdict's implications for property rights. Sentencing came a week later. Judge Hamilton Marshall was a man known for thoughtful deliberation rather than fiery oratory, but his words carried weight. "Mr. Hartley," he began, "you stand convicted of perhaps the most heinous crimes this court has seen. You took human beings, and whatever their legal status, they were and are human beings, and subjected them to systematic torture and murder in pursuit of knowledge. You kept meticulous records of their suffering. You showed no mercy, no remorse, no recognition of their humanity." He paused, looking directly at Hartley. "Your defense argued that you acted within your property rights, but there are limits even to property rights in a civilized society. A man may own an animal, but he may not torture it for his own amusement. The law recognizes cruelty even to livestock. How much more, then, must it recognize cruelty to human beings? You have been found guilty of 17 counts of murder. The evidence suggests the actual number may be higher. This court sentences you to death by hanging, to be carried out 60 days hence. May God have mercy on your soul, for this court finds little reason to extend mercy beyond what the law requires." Hartley showed no emotion as the sentence was pronounced. He was led from the courtroom quietly, and according to the deputies who guarded him, he spent his remaining weeks reading medical journals and working on what he called his final treatise on his discoveries at Riverside. Nathaniel Hartley was hanged on January 15, 1859, at the Charleston County Jail. It was a cold morning with frost on the ground and a gray sky that threatened rain. As was customary, Hartley was given an opportunity to make a final statement. The crowd that had gathered, much smaller than usual for a public execution, as Charleston society was deeply uncomfortable with the entire case, expected a confession or perhaps a plea for forgiveness. They got neither. "I stand before you condemned," Hartley said, his voice calm and clear. "Not for doing wrong, but for doing what others lack the courage to do. Medical science has advanced through the study of human anatomy, through understanding how the body functions and fails. My only crime was taking that study seriously, conducting it systematically, and documenting it properly." There were murmurs from the crowd, a mixture of anger and discomfort. "History will vindicate me," Hartley continued. 50 years from now, 100 years from now, physicians will use knowledge similar to what I gained at Riverside. They will simply have found ways to acquire it that society finds more palatable. But the knowledge itself, the understanding of human anatomy, of pain response, of physiological limits, that knowledge will be used. And in that use, my work will live on, whether acknowledged or not." He was hanged without further ceremony. According to witnesses, he met death calmly, without resistance or apparent fear. The Riverside Plantation property was seized by the county to settle legal debts and claims from Hartley's creditors. The enslaved population faced an uncertain future. Legally, they were still property, part of Hartley's estate. After considerable legal wrangling, and intervention by some abolition-minded attorneys who saw the case as an opportunity to challenge some aspects of slavery law, most were eventually purchased by families who had been searching for missing loved ones, or were acquired by plantations where they had relatives. Jacob, the young man whose escape had broken the case open, was purchased by a Quaker family with abolitionist sympathies and was quietly helped to freedom via the Underground Railroad. He eventually settled in Pennsylvania, where he lived under an assumed name for the rest of his life. He never spoke publicly about his experiences at Riverside. Marcus Webb continued working as a county clerk for another year, but the Riverside case had fundamentally changed him. The meticulous record-keeper who had found comfort in orderly numbers had seen what happened when human beings were reduced to entries in a ledger. In 1860, he resigned his position and moved to Massachusetts, where he became active in the abolitionist movement. After the Civil War, he worked with the Freedmen's Bureau, helping former enslaved people navigate the legal and bureaucratic systems of their new freedom. Reverend Jonathan Pritchard remained in South Carolina, continuing his ministry work but with a new intensity. He began quietly assisting the Underground Railroad, using his position as a traveling minister to help people escape slavery. He was never caught, though several times he came close. After the war, he devoted himself to helping establish schools for freed people and lobbying for their civil rights. He died in 1883, still working to address the systemic injustices he had witnessed. Sheriff Thomas Dalton served out his term but chose not to run for re-election in 1860. The Riverside case had aged him visibly. He organized the proper burial of all the victims found at Riverside, insisting that each grave have a marker even when names were unknown. He kept a private journal in his later years where he wrote extensively about the case, trying to process what he'd seen and what it meant. One entry, written in 1867, reads, "Men debate whether slavery is moral or practical, whether it should be gradually abolished or immediately ended." But Riverside shows us something deeper and more disturbing. It shows us what happens when one human being has absolute power over another. Hartley was educated, intelligent, even cultured in his way. He wasn't a sadist or a madman. He was a man who had been given complete control over other people's lives, and had convinced himself that this control gave him the right to use them however he saw fit. The evil wasn't in Hartley alone. It was in the system that made Hartley possible. That made his crimes legal, his victims voiceless, and his actions nearly invisible. We caught him only by chance, by coincidence, by a clerk's obsession with proper paperwork and a minister's refusal to stop asking questions. How many other Riverside plantations are there that we don't know about? How many people have disappeared into similar hells with no one to notice or care? That's the question that haunts me. The journals that Hartley kept, those meticulous records of torture and murder, became a subject of intense debate in medical and legal circles. Some physicians argued they should be studied despite their horrific origin, that the anatomical knowledge they contained could save lives regardless of how it was gained. Others insisted they should be destroyed entirely, that legitimizing such research would only encourage future atrocities. The legal resolution came in 1861, just before the outbreak of the Civil War. A judge ordered the journals sealed and placed in a restricted archive, accessible only with court permission and only for specific legal or historical research purposes. They were not to be used for medical education or practice. The decision was a compromise that satisfied no one, but at least prevented the journals from becoming standard medical references. The journals remain in that restricted archive today, a testament to what human beings are capable of when the law fails to recognize certain people as human beings. The Riverside Plantation case became a touchstone in debates about slavery, medical ethics, and human rights in the years leading up to the Civil War. Abolitionists pointed to it as evidence of slavery's inherent evil, that any system giving one person absolute power over another would inevitably produce horrors like Riverside. Pro-slavery advocates, meanwhile, argued that Hartley was an aberration, that his actions were already illegal under existing law, though this claim was complicated by the legal ambiguities the trial had revealed, and that his crime said nothing about the institution of slavery itself. The truth, as Dalton had noted in his journal, was more disturbing than either side wanted to acknowledge. Hartley wasn't an aberration. He was what became possible in a system that classified certain people as property rather than persons. He didn't create the conditions that allowed his crimes. He merely took advantage of conditions that already existed. After the Civil War, as scholars began documenting the history of slavery, Riverside Plantation became a case study in what historians would call medical experimentation on enslaved people. Research revealed that Hartley's crimes, while extreme, were not entirely unique. There were other cases, less well documented, of physicians and plantation owners conducting medical procedures on enslaved people without consent. What made Riverside unusual was that it had been fully investigated and prosecuted, that the evidence had been preserved, and that the victims had been named and remembered. The site of Riverside Plantation today is subdivided into residential properties. Few current residents know the history of the land they live on. The old plantation house burned down in 1871. Some say it was set by former enslaved people returning to destroy the place of their torment, though this was never proven. The ice house was demolished by county authorities shortly after Hartley's trial, and the ground where it stood was intentionally left uncultivated for decades, as if no one wanted to disturb whatever remained there. In 1995, a group of historians and descendant community members erected a small memorial at the site of the former slave quarters. It lists the names of the 17 confirmed victims whose identities were established through Hartley's journals: Thomas, Ruth, Samuel, Eliza, William, Patience, Joshua, David, Hannah, Naomi, Gabriel, Lydia, Benjamin, Rachel, Amos, Dinah, Charles. The memorial also includes a plaque with a longer list of names, 43 in total, representing everyone who was documented as having been at Riverside during Hartley's years there. Some survived. Some didn't. Some endured procedures and carried the scars the rest of their lives. Some disappeared without trace. But the memorial insists they all be remembered, that their names not vanish the way Hartley tried to make them vanish. At the bottom of the memorial, there's an inscription. Asterisk: here stood Riverside Plantation, where human beings were treated as experimental subjects. These people suffered and died so that one man could satisfy his curiosity about human anatomy. Their deaths were hidden, their suffering ignored, their voices silenced. We remember them now. We name them now. We acknowledge that what happened here was evil, that it was enabled by a system that denied their humanity, and that the responsibility for remembering them is ours. Asterisk. Every year on January 15th, the anniversary of Hartley's execution, descendants of Riverside survivors and local community members gather at the memorial for a small ceremony. They read the names, share what little is known about each person, and reflect on what Riverside means for how we think about medical ethics, human rights, and the uses and abuses of power. The Riverside case asks uncomfortable questions. How do we value knowledge that was gained through evil? If Hartley had made genuine medical discoveries, and by some accounts, his anatomical observations were detailed and accurate, would using that knowledge make us complicit in how it was obtained? Does the potential to save future lives justify the sacrifice of past lives, especially when that sacrifice was neither voluntary nor acknowledged? Medical ethics today rests in part on the foundation laid by cases like Riverside, the principles of informed consent, the prohibition on human experimentation without ethical oversight, the recognition that even prisoners and other vulnerable populations have rights that cannot be violated in the name of science. All of these arose partly from a reckoning with cases like Hartley's. But perhaps the most important lesson of Riverside is the most uncomfortable one. That evil doesn't always look like cruelty or rage. Sometimes it looks like rational inquiry. Sometimes it wears the mask of progress and scientific advancement. Sometimes it arrives with meticulous note-taking and careful documentation. Nathaniel Hartley saw himself as a scientist, as someone making important contributions to human knowledge. He didn't hate his victims. He barely saw them as people at all. They were resources, opportunities to learn things that couldn't be learned any other way. In his mind, he was serving the greater good. And in a system that classified certain people as property rather than persons, in a legal structure that gave him nearly absolute power over them, there was almost nothing to stop him except his own conscience. And his conscience, shaped by a society that told him some lives mattered less than others, provided no barrier at all. The horror of Riverside isn't just what happened there. It's how easily it happened, how long it continued unnoticed, and how close it came to never being discovered at all. If not for a clerk's obsessive attention to record-keeping discrepancies, if not for a minister's refusal to stop asking questions, if not for one young man's desperate escape, Nathaniel Hartley might have continued his work indefinitely. The people who disappeared at Riverside would have remained disappeared, their suffering erased, their deaths unacknowledged, their names forgotten. That's the legacy of Riverside. A reminder that systematic evil requires systematic resistance. That some people's lack of legal standing doesn't make them any less human. And that the question, who counts as a person, is always dangerous, and always has been asked by those in power to justify what they do to those without power. The memorial stands on ground that was once soaked in suffering, in a place where the worst potentials of human behavior were realized through the intersection of curiosity, power, and the systematic dehumanization of others. It stands as testimony, as warning, as a demand that we remember what happens when we forget that all human beings are, in fact, human. The people who disappeared at Riverside weren't escaping. They were being erased. And when investigators finally discovered the truth, they found something worse than escape, worse than sale, worse than any explanation that allowed for hope or closure. They found evidence of systematic, rational, carefully documented proof that cruelty doesn't always look like rage. Sometimes it looks like science. Sometimes it looks like progress. Sometimes it wears the face of advancement and speaks in the language of the greater good. And sometimes, the most important resistance we can offer is simply refusing to forget. Refusing to let the vanished remain vanished. Refusing to accept that some lives leave no trace. That's why the names are carved in stone now at Riverside. So that what was hidden can no longer be hidden. So that what was ignored can no longer be ignored. So that the people Nathaniel Hartley tried to reduce to data points and anatomical specimens can be remembered as what they truly were. Human beings who suffered, who feared, who hoped, and who deserved so much better than what was done to them in that ice house by the Ashley River. Their names remain. Their story endures. And with it, the reminder that the greatest evil is often committed not in passionate hatred, but in cold rationality, by people who have convinced themselves that some lives simply matter less than others.